The world is changing in a lot of interesting ways, and economists are particularly interested in trade, tariffs, and all the talk of a trade war. But another important change has been the US administration's change in the way that it provides aid to the world. You may have read that President Trump completely dismantled the organization known as USAID. And we've seen the repercussions of this in South Africa as there's been funding cuts for key health programs that used to be funded by USAID, but is not anymore. To talk about this, I've invited my colleague, Prof. Gabila Nubong, to chat to us on this world of aid and how things work. Gabila, your, I want to say, first comments on what's happening in the world out there.
Well, thanks so much, Valdo, and good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are on this. I think we're going through very interesting times, and the posture that the U.S. government has taken as far as their aid is concerned has obviously upsetted a number of people. There have been consequences in terms of health and HIV/AIDS programs, and suspension of funding and hardship to so many people. But that takes us to the broader debate about aid in itself and the role that it plays in the assistance to programs like health programs, HIV and AIDS support programs in a country like South Africa. So from that perspective, it's unfortunate because it was certain. A lot of people went for Christmas and planned 2025 to have a beautiful year, and by the month of March, they're out of work, and programs have been suspended. So, from that perspective, the lack of policy predictability and the sort of quote unquote disregard for concern for the bilateral relationship, it should be a cause for concern for a country like South Africa. On the rest of the continent, there have been consequences as well because USAID programs are also funding other countries on the continent. But if you look at the approach to aid on the continent with respect to South Africa, you may want to think that would want to imagine that the consequences on those other countries would be higher for the simple fact that South Africa's aid is an extra budgetary item. So the Department of Health in South Africa does not factor in aid in its annual budget. It has an operational budget for its priorities, and the philosophy of South African government towards aid has always been that it is a welcome plus. Which is good because then it secures the main programs like the functioning of hospitals, payment of staff, and the maintenance of essential health services. But that would not be the case for other African countries. There are other African countries whose health budgets are heavily aid dependent. Thankfully, not exclusively US aid, other donors like the EU and other donors in Japan and the rest of the world. But I would want to imagine that they have been more affected than South Africa has been with the decisions that were taken out of the Trump administration.
Ah, I've seen some numbers, and I think around 30% of USAID money went to African countries. But one of the interesting things is that it didn't go to local organizations. USAID projects were mostly run by US organizations. So in that sense, there are about 25 big organizations in the US that used to operate everywhere else that lost their funding. So I think that's one thing that's I think different than one would expect. I think in people's minds they think this aid was just simply like cash given to governments and they could and it didn't work like that. But like you say, the numbers in other African countries are significant. A lot of the service provided specifically in health, but also a bit in education, some in agriculture, uh, and I want to say within health, it was HIV and AIDS, malaria, and I think TB and maternal and child health.
Yeah.
Those were the big ones, and USAID has now cut, I think, like 90% of programs, which is a significant number.
That's something that a lot of people do not really understand about aid. I give you a funny example that came out, funny and unfortunate. The comments that President Trump made about Lesotho recently. Not the other comment, but the fact that he said his government had given $8 million. And the corresponding department in Lesotho came out and says we did not receive any such money, which for me then highlighted the bulk of what most people sometimes do not understand about aid, that the figures do not translate to absolute amounts that go from one government to the other. Like you said, for the bulk of this, most of it, these are American companies that, for a variety of reasons, engage in projects overseas. There's a percentage of it that is altruism. There's a percentage of it that is trying to make the world a better place, but the large, significant chunk of it is strategic. Strategic in terms of the expansion of their research, HIV and AIDS research. Strategic in terms of the expansion of their own medical industry and pharmaceutical industry. And that has been the reality of aid from time immemorial. The Americans are just catching up to what the Europeans have done. A few years back, when I used to work for the EU, the philosophy of aid began to change, and they started pushing forward blended programs. So they came up with ideas that said we would not just give money to African countries. What we are going to do is we are going to use our funding as seed funding grants to carry out, say, feasibility studies to unblock loans for our investment banks. So they came up with blended funding mechanisms for a variety of infrastructure projects and so on. So for each of the areas in which they were intervening. So the philosophy of aid has slightly, it's very different from one donor to the other. The Chinese have a different philosophy of aid from the rest of the world. The Japanese have. So with respect to the US, yes, I think that people need to be conscious of the fact that, as with the EU, as with the US, the bulk of what gets documented as aid actually goes back to European companies and to American companies, and does not really translate to actual amounts that fit. So from an economic growth perspective, from a financing for development perspective, it's not a meaningful source of capital that you could factor in terms of your planning to say that we're receiving X amount of money, because no, they would manage the tendering process, they would issue the contract, they would manage the implementation of the contracts. Even the payments will go from American accounts to American accounts, with just the services and a few ground staff and contact people that sometimes get, and sometimes purchase of equipment or specified chunks that needs to get executed at the level of implementation on the ground. But the bulk of it, like you said, it goes to American companies. And that makes sense, because if you look at, for example, and this is the logic, you should ask yourself, all through the subprime rate crisis in the US, every time the world has faced a global crisis, or there's been a crisis in the US or been a crisis in the EU, it has not stopped. Because it doesn't make sense. If you're facing financial crisis, economic crisis, you cannot be generous or altruistic. You cannot be leaving your own unemployment, your own collapsing banking sector to go and try and save the world. And the only reason that has been is because it is essentially provision of employment for their companies and their staff to do work in the rest of the world that advances a variety of interests: scientific research interests, strategic foreign policy interests, and they just put it in a language that says we're trying to make the world a better place.
I think that's a really interesting point, particularly when you look at the bigger world of like overseas development assistance. I think within the narrow confines of health, there's been really big successes, and you can see sort of diseases rolled back due to this. But the bigger aid project to develop poor countries, that hasn't been a big success. Aid has not driven development.
It has not driven development, and it's fun fact and conspiracy. Some people may call it conspiracy theories. For example, countries like South Africa have succeeded to eradicate malaria in significant segments of the country. I can't think if they are just pockets. And the argument is often made that pharmaceutical industries that sponsor or fund malaria research on the continent do not fund it to eradicate it, because if you do eradicate malaria, then the whole drug industry that is curative in nature then gets to disappear. And that is where you talk about aid serving a strategic purpose. If you're going to send funding that is going to go into the health sector that seeks or intends to solve the question, resolve the issue, eradicate malaria, that would be the logical thing to do. And the fact that there are a number of African countries and a number of countries around the world that have succeeded to eradicate something like malaria tells you it's possible. But there is a whole industry for the production of malaria drugs. And it becomes necessary, therefore, for all countries to adopt a very sensible approach in their engagement with some of what comes across as support and aid. Bottom line, most people would not just give you, as you say in economics, there's no free lunch. So the world is not made up of, they are good people, no doubt, people who are invested in making the world a better place. Engagements in malaria and interventions in lots of African countries has helped to reduce child mortality, for example, and improve health outcomes. So there's a positive story to be told about the support that has come from the rest of the world. But the bigger picture, the larger amounts and the bigger figures when it comes to overseas development assistance has a much more nuanced story, which recipients are supposed to be aware about and also go in there to forge their strategic interest, because that is the way the nature of relationships between nations operates.
And I think one of the sad points to me of what's happening at the moment is I've seen a graph where uh, the other forms of aid, the aid that goes into agriculture, education, security, those they've leveled off, but they haven't dropped off. It's the health aid that's dropped off, and that money is now going to uh, internal refugees. So the countries dealing with their own refugees problem, they're rather spending the money there. Where I think the health spending was the one bright light
Like
in this story.
ground.
And well, I think in our president commented on the loss of funding for the PEPFAR projects and HIV research, and said, well, they're already speaking to other possible donors. What's your thought on is someone going to step in here, or should we be stepping in ourselves and reprioritize spending?
To be honest with you, it for the long-term strategic interest for a country like South Africa, there are certain sensitive sectors that should not be dependent on external funding, um, especially not with something like health. I would be, from a macroeconomic and fiscal budgetary perspective, we know that we are running out of funds and we're threatening to increase VAT, and there's no money. Is the general conversation, but reprioritization, I think, would be to the long-term strategic interest of the country. South Africa should never have placed itself in a position in the first place where America could do what they just did. For a country that is aspiring for a seat on the UN Security Council, projecting itself as a leader on the continent, leadership comes at a price. If you want to be a leading nation, there are certain things that you're supposed to be able to take care of as basics, like the health of your people. So, reprioritization of expenditure that says that we would not allow ourselves to be insulted by the hand that is giving, and we are going to collaborate on other aspects and other areas. I think it's in the long-term strategic interest of a country like South Africa. Yes, things like research is expensive. Research and development often gets balanced against priorities like in social and health-related education kind of expenditure, but that's the price you pay for wanting to be a leading nation. So I would rather very much we have a social conversation that seeks to mobilize internal resources, maybe participation from the private sector in exchange for tax credits, innovative financial mechanisms that says we chunk out we chunk out the figure, set an amount to it, and then have a national conversation that says this is an aspect of national pride. Let's get the let's get the resources funded. I mean, I was listening to a conversation recently that speaks about the number of South African millionaires and billionaires that they are around in the world. And it's been a lot of conversation, especially in the advent of the GNU, that says there is money, but the people that have money do not trust um, a number of things that are happening at the moment. So they tend to keep this money offshore, and a number of them adopted a wait and see approach. So it will be a question of responding to the sort of incentives that these people are concerned about, and making them to come to the party to be able to finance some of these critical sectors. We should not be in a position where another foreign government makes a decision that causes our citizens to suffer, especially in the area of health. It's an aspect of sovereignty that's should be internalized.
Oh, I agree. And I think there are some interesting numbers that Ken Opolo has a nice blog post on this where he says even Tanzania should be able to afford this. I'm like, even Tanzania, but Tanzania can afford this, reprioritizing spending, that the dollar share of health spending that they used to get from USAID in the total budget is not that big. It's really, it's countries like Sierra Leone
Yeah,
that cannot afford
afford it. Yeah.
going without the aid. South Africa should not be asking anyone for money.
Absolutely.
And I think a week or so ago, I spoke to some guys who they're working in the nutrition part of health in African countries, and it was interesting. No one said, "No worries, the EU is going to step up. Bill and Melinda Gates is going to send the money, or we'll take it to the Chinese." Almost throughout, the message was, "We need to start doing this ourselves," which was really
Yeah,
refreshing, I think.
absolutely. It's a sense of personal national pride. I think it's actually a sense of responsibility. I think this is a responsibility that says you are a government and your primary responsibility is the well-being of your citizens in every aspect, in their health, in their social and economic, and especially health is such a critical aspect of human capital and labor force and productivity. It's an economic priority. For you not to prioritize it, you are shooting yourself in the leg in terms of productivity of labor and contributions to growth of the economy in the long term. So it should actually not just be seen as a strategic priority, but it's actually an investment in the long-term growth and development of the country. Healthy people, strong people that are educated and skilled are an asset to every country, and that should be topmost priority. They should give up their BMWs and drive Unos to work to be able to sponsor the health budget.
Kabila, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent point to end
Oh,
on.
appreciate it.
So that's it for this episode of the Economics Weekly. Join us again for more interesting discussions about what's happening in the South African economy, what's happening in a world that's changing. Like, share, and please do that.